Hello and welcome to week 8 of our sensory evaluation class. I hope everybody is doing well, and thankfully as of now the cases are going down, and I hope all of you and your loved ones are in good health or are fighting really hard. So we're officially more than halfway through the SEM, and this week we'll be discussing descriptive tests. So have you ever found yourself at a loss for words? Especially when describing food, may tinikman ka, tinanong ka kung kumusta, anong lasa, no? Like, nasa restaurant kayo, first time mo tumikim ng something with your friends, and all you could say is, masarap siya. Di ba? Parang, can you elaborate on that? Can you tell me if it's sweet, it's spicy, uh, what flavors do you feel or can you associate it with? And sometimes it's just at the tip of your tongue, literally. I mean, natikman mo siya, familiar siya, it tastes like something you've known, or you know this is a particular fruit or a particular spice, but just can't describe it. Well, that's what descriptive sensory evaluation is for. No? Like another way of looking at this is making a cartographic sketch of food. No? Parang de-describe mo yung food, magpipinoyhenyo kayo. Masarap ba to? Of course. Matamis ba to? Pula ba siya? Malaki? Mapakla? Um, lasang cinnamon? So on. May hint of sesame seed, etc. etc. So basically that's what descriptive sensory evaluation is, but we're adding quantities to it. We try to put numbers to quantify how strong those descriptions are. So before we dive into the nitty-gritty, first let's look at saan ba ginagamit itong mga descriptive test. So of course, when we want to define the sensory properties of a food product for new development, okay, so we want to make a profile for that product, of course, to compare it to maybe what's existing in the market, okay? So like comparing apples to apples, one kind of apple to another. Alright, so we also wanted to define the characteristic or specification for a control or standard, usually for QA, QC, R&D applications. Since descriptive sensory test is expensive, most small or even medium to large size companies locally don't do this, no? Pero you can actually do it. If you can profile a food product with this method, you can know if, for example, over time, nagbabago ba yung specification ng product or ingredient na ito. Na, for example, you've had this supplier of, let's say, your cocoa powder for a decade now. And then eventually, um, parang nagbago yung lasa ng product nyo and you've traced it to the cocoa powder. If you were able to do a descriptive profile of your cocoa powder from 10 years ago and you have a trained panel that has the same ability now that you had 10 years ago, you can actually try your best to replicate the sensory test and see kung mag-iiba nga yung result na naging mas mapait ba siya, nagbago ba yung color niya, yung grittiness sa kamay, or even the product. You can test the product to see what about the product changed. Is it the texture? Is it the certain flavor notes? Is it the overall color and so on? Lastly, you can use it to document product attributes prior to a consumer test so that you can help in the selection of attributes to be included in the questionnaire. So kapag ikaw gumagawa ng consumer test questionnaire, isipin mo, descriptive test yan, analytical test, anong kinalaman niya sa consumer test? Most consumer tests would require you to, or rather all consumer tests would require to have a set of carefully worded questions. And if you cannot describe your own food properly, you can ask open-ended questions. Pero kung gusto mong mas determined, like, how do you like the insert descriptor here to elicit response, no? Kasi kung merong certain flavor notes yung product mo, like say, licorice, okay. Diba? Siyempre kailangan alam mo yung word na yun. Magamit mo yung word na madaling ma-identify ng consumer para ma-evoke, so to speak, na maisip nila, ito yung hinahanap kong flavor, note, or aroma, and so on, or maybe texture attribute. So shameless plug, no? The Food Application Sensory Lab is currently doing projects on virgin coconut oils, and they're actually coming up with, or rather, they came up with a descriptive sensory analysis manual for VCO na pwedeng gamitin, hopefully in the future, even by VCO manufacturers, no? So one practical application is, for example, in the case of VCO, you can track the changes in the product, for example, when using it for shelf life or packaging studies, and you can correlate the instrumental or physicochemical test results, or let's say indices of oxidative rancidity na mga analytical test. Pwede mo makorelate yung numbers doon sa makukuha mo sa descriptive analysis na napaperceive na changes ng panelist doon sa kanilang sample. So a descriptive test is an analytical test which requires, maybe for all of the types of sensory tests we've seen so far, the highest level of training. All right. So typically, wala kang makikitang descriptive test na untrained yung panel. Kapag may gumawa nun, malaki ang pagkukulang nila sa kaalaman sa sensory evaluation, and most likely yung results ng descriptive test na yon ay medyo epic fail, so to speak. When you have a trained panel, of course, because of the training, they can detect the more subtle differences between samples, and they even describe it. Kasi sa difference test, kahit ganong galing sa difference test ng isang tao na untrained, ang masasagot lang niya, may difference ba o wala? Yes or no, 1 or 0. Pero dito, okay, nasan yung difference? Nasa aroma, which particular aroma? Yung parang burnt sugar aroma niya. Ganon. Gano'ng kalaki yung difference? Light, moderate, extreme, on a scale of 1 to 10. It's 7.69. No more, no less. Hindi, joke lang, walang ganun katindi. No? Kahit tao pa yan. Superhuman ba yan? Okay. When you have a trained panel used for discrimination tests in assessing large products with complex instruction, since you are trained, especially with the use of that product, you are less likely to suffer fatigue. Okay, ano bang klaseng fatigue yung pwede mong masuffer na kailangan talaga ng training for? There's a descriptive sensory evaluation procedure for chilies, maanghang. And even for something like mantika, as in buong araw kang tumitikim ng mantika as is, no? Naamoy mo, tinititigan mo, and so on. Use all your senses. Siyempre nakakasuya yun. Wala nga sa atin sigurong kumakain ng hilaw na mantika dito. I mean, hilaw tuloy. Yung walang halo na iba, no? Unless mantika, baboy yan, drippings or something. Alright. And usually, when you have a trained panel, you cannot use that panel for acceptability or preference test. Actually, the other way around, yung panelist mo for acceptability or preference, hindi rin pwede sa descriptive. Okay? Well, kasi usually yung mga descriptive panelists, you can say that they may be consumers as well, pero masyado na silang nuanced, sumagot pa minsan. Oo, hindi na, yung level nila, iba na, no? Pero technically, kung kaya nilang ilagay yung sarili nila sa shoes ng isang consumer, why not? Pero most likely kasi if you have a descriptive panel on hand, sila yung mga colleagues mo na medyo may bias dun sa products dahil alam na alam nila. So you would likely use people you don't know from other departments or general population for acceptability or preference test. So this may look familiar for some of you who've been to the CHE FS131 sensory evaluation classes no kayo naging panelist. For a descriptive test, same din naman yung setup niya. So you can have the booths, dividers, or yung individual na separated booths, okay? And a preparation area for the samples. So ito sa ano to, no? sa CHE room 102, 103. Alright. For testing purposes, similar lang yung requirements mo for the consumer test and this difference test, okay? Except na, of course, you need a trained panelist and also a trained set of analysts. Higher level of training din yung analyst, syempre, kasi dapat kaya mong mas mataas ka dun sa level ng panelists mo, okay, with regard to product knowledge. So in a descriptive test, okay, there are qualitative aspects, quantitative aspects, and also the order of appearance. So dito pa lang alam niyo na ang dami ng types of data. Obviously may ordinal, merong nominal, and then there are likely yung quantitative, maybe usually interval ang pagturing dito dahil trained naman yung panelists. Okay. So for example, if you can look at this one galing sa BCO manual, each component has a description, a definition. So ito yung qualitative aspect. Kapag dinedetect nyo or ang tinetest nyo, for example, ay turbidity, then you have to understand this definition, have a common understanding, and then meron kayong numerical intensities that these solutions are calibrated to your eyes, no, to have a certain numerical value. And then sometimes meron din order of appearance or order of presentation. Na syempre kapag nagtetest ka lang mga amoy or lasa, merong nauunang lumabas. Yung unang singhot mo yun agad yung nandun, and then meron yung mga nasa dulo, pati sa pagtikim din, no? In fact, though hindi ko ito tinuturo in the food industry, yung mga flavor companies, they usually have what they call the top notes, the base notes, the end notes. It's simply a manner of saying, ito yung mga una mong maamoy or malasahan, ito yung naglilinger habang kinakain mo yung food, and ito yung natitira pagkalunok mo after mong kainin yung food. Hindi kasi masyadong nakabase sa scientific literature masyado. So, but people in the flavor industry like to use those terms, no? If you do get into the R&D. So sa qualitative aspect, kanina remember yung isang slide natin, words can describe. Well, now you need to know your words. Okay, so in this case, this is what we usually call a flavor or aroma wheel. So it has 3 layers, yung inner and then yung outer. So nandito yung mga basic descriptors, and then pa-advance ng pa-advance or pa-specific ng pa-specific. So general to specific, inward to outward. So this is most likely for, well, you can maybe use this for wine. Okay. All right. So usually you need a dictionary for this. You start by looking for terms and defining them, especially as they relate to the specific sensory profile of your food or food group. So if you're evaluating more than one sample, usually yung descriptors na pinipili mo ay yung medyo mas common sa kanilang lahat. Like for example, if you're doing chocolate peanut bars, hindi ka naman maglalagay doon ng something related to spice or something related to fruity banana notes if you don't expect to find that in the brands that you are analyzing. Yeah, in that regard, you should select and the definitions ng mga tsaka yung mga terms mo depending on what the existing product characteristics are. Okay, and you should first have a good understanding of rheology and chemistry of the product to make your definitions and thus the descriptive data in the long run easier for decision making. So what do we mean by this? For example, pag texture, usually may kinalaman yan sa definitions na ginagamit sa texture profile analysis na instrumental, yung TPA machine. Wala tayong ganun sa lab sadly kasi mahal yun. If you have aromas, usually you can relate them to certain chemicals that have been isolated and are known to have that chemical as their primary source of aroma or flavor. Like let's say limonene, diba sa Chem 31 ninyo in lemons. So talagang out of the many compounds na meron sa isang, let's say fruit, for example, sa citrus fruit, it's the limonene that provides most of that citrus smell you're looking for. So if you have defined terms to use in your sensory evaluation, panelists should be trained first and foremost to fully understand those terms. Na lahat, kung walo kayong panelist, same kayo ng pagkaintindi sa meaning ng bawat definition ng bawat salita. Okay? For example, ako for the long run, akala ko ang ibig sabihin ng mapakla ay bland. So, unless na-define yun ng tama sa akin, pag pinasensory mo ko maybe 15 years ago, na may term na mapakla, iba yung magiging sagot ko. Okay? And usually, to do that, we have references. No? Pag sinabi nating lemon aroma, reminiscent of limonene, then you have a limonene extract or a fruit extract na amoy talaga yung close to pure or diluted limonene. Okay, so you have to choose your references properly para mag-guide yung terminology na pag sinabi mong this is number 1 on the softness scale and you have a marshmallow for the panelist to press with his or her fingers. So parang ganon. But even then, you have to describe how would you assess the texture of this sample. Is it by pressing the sample against a flat surface with your finger? Is it squeezing it in between your fingers or something like that? Those have to be very specific. So kung may qualitative aspect, may quantitative aspect din. Usually we use scales to, based on the qualitative description, try to quantify the intensity or the degree to which each characteristic is present. So remember, we have line scales, category scales, and even magnitude estimation scales. So magnitude estimation is the one that's least utilized, at least in the most descriptive tests, no? But usually, meron tayo nito yung 0 to 150 na line scale, or sometimes they even use, let's say for QDA, mga category scales. Alright, so that depends of course on the sample type, kung gaano siya kadaling, and saka yung ano yung dinedescribe mo. Kasi minsan, pointless na gumawa ka ng 0 to 150 scale if it's something that you can only detect in, let's say, 5 increments or 7 increments. So our guideline for the selection of the scale type or scaling technique is that it should be broad enough to encompass the full range of parameter intensities and have enough discrete points to pick up small differences. So yung breadth is ano ba yung ilalagay mong ends ng scale? Halimbawa, kung ang tinetest mo ay tinapay na expected mong malambot, hindi mo kailangan maglagay ng dun sa hardness scale mo na extreme end ay kasing tigas ng candy, kung hindi mo naman nini-expect na may tinapay in existence na kasing tigas ng candy, right? On the other hand, kung candy naman din ang tinitignan mo, hindi ka maglalagay on the other end ng scale na ang kabilang dulo ay parang marshmallow. But of course, doing so would restrict your scale to that of an interval type. Tsaka lalo na ang hirap naman din kasi magsabi ano ba yung isang true zero for a specific sample intensity. So through training, the panelists are made better in how to use those reference samples in their analysis. Okay? And kailangan pare-parehas yung pag-analyze nila na yung procedure. Minsan kapag texture yan sa bunganga, ilang nguya, anong ngipin yung ipangunguya mo, molars ba yan, incisors ba yan, ganun ka-specific. And of course, when you have reference scale for intensity of different properties, they are there to make things consistent, no? So, kapag halimbawa meron kang texture parameter, yun nga, ano ba yung actual reference na ipapagamit mo? Is it may marshmallow ka on one end of the extreme, tapos meron kang cookie dun sa kabila? para lahat sila alam na on a scale of 1 to 5, yung number 1 is a marshmallow, yung number 5 is a cookie, parang ganun. So if you were to look at published sensory evaluation papers or papers utilizing sensory evaluation and descriptive, usually ganito yung makikita nyo. Para ma-replicate sila, kailangan as much detail as possible in detail ng definition and what reference you're using. Usually kung ang reference mo ay isang product available on the market, then you state the brand and variant as well, no? Like anong marshmallow yun, anong cookie, Chips Ahoy ba yan, Markenberg, ganon. Okay? And ano ba yung Chips Ahoy na chewy? Pati nga siguro kung saang bansa gawa eh. Kasi for example, we know some products are made in multiple countries and even if they're the same, let's say Oreo yan na yung original, iba yung gawang US sa gawang Indonesia. Okay, huwag na tayo magmaang-maangan. Okay. Maybe that would be a good thing to try on your triangle test, no? Kung makahanap kayo from 2 different countries. Alright, so makikita nyo dito, nandun yung name ng attribute, the definition. Okay. Tapos ito-train kayo, ano meaning na tong definition na to, ano ba yung testa, dapat lahat ng panelists alam ano yung testa doon sa coconut, and so on. And then if you have a specific reference, lahat kayo makalibrate na 60 yung intensity nandun sa scale natin. So, yung order of appearance, mahalaga siya when you evaluate a sample, tulad lang sa ibang sensory test, lalo na sa descriptive. Napakahalaga kung kailan mo siya i-evaluate, pang ilan siya. Okay? For example, in the VCO manual, you first start with the appearance, and then the aroma, and then the flavor. So, mahalaga din na sa testing procedure, tingnan natin kung pang ilan i-evaluate yung isang bagay. Usually, pag sa consumption, di ba, like if it's a potato chip or a corn snack, you eat it with your fingers, so meron ka, yung hand feel doon, mauuna bago mo tinikman. At saka syempre, hahawakan mo siya kasi kapag may pulbos na dumidikit sa kamay mo, nababawasan nun yung lasa sa bibig mo. So kung halimbawa yung, I don't know, Cheetos mo, kinutsara mo lang, mas intense yung flavor nun kasi hindi na napunta sa daliri mo yung cheese powder. On the other hand, kapag tinikman mo yung isang bagay, nandun din yung iba-iba mong nararanasan. Kapag ba maanghang yung isang pagkain tapos maalat at the same time, like Bicol Express, ano ba yung naunang tumatak sa kaluluwa mo? Yung alat ba niya o yung anghang ba niya? Okay? And then, syempre, sometimes you're testing at residual effects. For example, how long yung anghang remains in the throat. Now, if you tried those 8x, 16x, 32x na mga spicy noodles, nananaginip ka na, maanghang pa rin yung lalamunan mo sa panaginip mo. So, the time aspect is there and we have to take that into account. So, in the industry setting, wala masyadong gumagamit talaga ng descriptive sensory evaluation like you are an R&D for a certain Philippine company. Kahit malaki pa yan, like yung brand names that you know of, they don't normally use this. Bakit? Kasi mahal. Sobrang tedious ng process ng training. Imagine you pay your employees by the hour just to sit and eat stuff whole day. No? So, unless the top management understands kung para saan siya, malabong magamit niyo to sa industry unless malaki ang bayad sa mga produkto niyo, like premium products. And there's always the personal involvement and commitment. Now, for example, in a week, how many man-hours of your work would you have to spend on this? Tapos sabay-sabay kayong nag-evaluate ng mga sample kadalasan para uniform, matanggal yung factor ng magkaibang time of day kayo nag-analyze and so on and so forth. Okay. Right, so how do we do the recruitment? So there are many ways to do it. First, through seminars, questionnaires, or personal contact. No, kasi kailangan mong i-screen pa tong mga to, but you want as many, the best and the brightest, so to speak, and reference your product to be recruited. So you should inform them about what the sensory test is for. Kasi minsan, kung ang product mo ay very specific, like let's say sa virgin coconut oil, may advantage kung maghanap ka dun sa mga taong gumagawa or regular na tumitikim ng VCO. Kaysa mag-train ka ng isang taong magaling nga, pero pagdating naman sa VCO, never pa niya natikman, no? So yung 5 years worth o 10 years worth ng kaalaman ng dila mo, minsan mas madali ka na lang turuan ng paano mag-descriptive test kaysa kumuha ka ng isang, let's say tayo na nagtapos ng FS131 pero walang kaalam-alam dun sa produktong yun. Okay? And of course, you want to tell them that when you become a trained panelist, it's actually an asset for you kasi pwede ka na rin magamit sa ibang descriptive testing. No? In the CHE, karamihan ng mga kinukuha is mga staff mismo ng CHE kasi at least nandyan sila for the long run. Until they retire, they can opt to participate in more trainings and more projects. Okay, so in communicating, you should emphasize the importance of the screening na hindi porke nag-apply kayo, tanggap na kayo, and then ito yung mga i-screen namin para hindi naman sayang yung ano nila, di ba? Andun yung qualifications kung gusto mong may certain age range ba yan or may certain minimum requirement for experience with the product, dapat malinaw. So di hamak na mas stringent yung recruitment kapag ito ay para sa descriptive testing. Kasi long term, hindi lang yan yung isang bagsak na session tapos bye-bye, I take my incentive and I will never see you again. You're in here for months of training at the very minimum. So nandun dapat yung interest and availability mo for the duration of the training. Ang hirap mag-drop out. Diba, walo na lang kayo, di ba? Nag-drop out ka pa. Naka-jeopardize yun sa test, saka nag-invest sila sa'yo na malaki. Of course, since this is something done at the same time at a set schedule a few times a week, like 2 hours a day, 3 hours a week, halimbawa, then you should be prompt. Kasi kung sabay-sabay kayo mag-evaluate, hindi pwedeng nag-alive ka ng 30 minutes late. Of course, health is important. More so here kasi you're doing this in the long run, for the long run. Hindi pwede yung bigla ka na lang mawawala kasi inatake ka ng asthma, ng high blood, ganun. Okay, absent ka for 2 out of 3 sessions in a week. And since it's descriptive, you should be able to use your vocabulary to describe what you're seeing. Kasi although may form yan, dun sa phase halimbawa na nagde-develop ka ng vocabulary, kailangan mo talaga maging articulate. Or kung magko-comment ka, for example, dun sa form, kailangan ma-describe mo kung ano yung nahanap mo dun sa sample na ano yung parang panis na yon na taste or off taste na ano mo, na perceive mo. Pero hindi mo ma-describe qualitatively dun sa mga scale. Alright. And of course, dapat hindi ka rin biased about yung general category ng products. No? For example, if it's all VCO or if it's all chilies, so syempre, kung may adverse reaction ka sa maanghang, huwag mo nang pilitin yung sarili mo na mag-ano dun sa maanghang. Or kung halimbawa may burgers yung tinetest mo, tapos may notion ka na yung mga burgers ay weapon of oppression ng Western world. So, diba, dapat hindi ka na mag-participate kasi magiging biased yung responses mo, hindi ka na objective. Sa lahat ng test, dito ka dapat pinaka-objective sa descriptive. So even though a descriptive test would usually require a small number of panelists, like 8 to 12, you usually have to screen for as much as 3 times that amount. Okay? Kasi syempre, may mga magda-drop out, tapos dun sa isa-screen mo, alam mo naman na hindi lahat papasa. Kumbaga sa UPCAT, kung 10,000 lang ang tatanggapin ni UP, hindi naman 11,000 lang yung ipapa-exam mo, di ba? And you want to use the product class, it should ultimately be tested. Yun nga, so kung VCO yan, screening pa lang VCO na para magkaalaman na. Hindi yung pag nag-screen ka, ang gagamitin mo para makatipid, canola oil, yung mga flavor notes na hinahanap mo, wala naman lahat dun. Okay, and yun nga, so you should prepare the sample variation similar to those in the actual test. It may be the same, pwede rin hindi. Siyempre, kung may mga brand yan, di pwede kang gumamit ng ibang brand na wala dun sa test. Okay, para hindi naman exactly the same in samples. And in screening, you want to select the proper test methods that will be used in the actual test. So kung kunwari papagamitin mo sila ng line scale, then it should be at least that similar line scale to the one that you will be using in the actual training and testing. So when you screen, you don't expect your candidates to be very good at sensory evaluation techniques, no? Kasi baka ini-screen mo sa kanila ay yung acuity nila or familiarity with the product. So you must make sure that they understand how to do the test methods and score sheets. May orientation, may samples, etc. I remember nung nagpapabakuna ako for COVID-19, I have a comorbidity, hindi ako sumingit sa pila. Sumisigaw pa dun yung tao para i-orient kung paano i-fill out yung mga information sheet. Kasi yung mga magpapabakuna, minsan hindi alam kung paano when do you answer in the affirmative or the negative. So parang ganun din, no? You must make sure na medyo idiot-proof yung orientation mo. Repeat the test to determine reproducibility. So if you screen, you don't just have to test them once. Maybe there are times when you have to make them come back twice or thrice. So hindi sa yung para ka lang mag-apply ng trabaho, interviewin ka, pa-exam, uwi na. Mas madugo yung proseso. Kaya dapat yung compensation sa panelists ay medyo malaki din, no? And in the absence of partial or there should be absence of partial or full dentures rather. Kasi ang mga pustiso ay siyempre nakaka-affect sa textural property perception. Hindi naman sa nagdi-discriminate tayo against people with dentures, pero part ng trabaho yun di ba? We need to make sure na yung integrity ng data ay hindi ma-affect just because certain people have maybe disabilities that would prevent them from doing their jobs properly. Of course, we also should be certain that the candidates can discriminate between samples that are known to be different. So, usually kapag magpapascreen ka, pwede rin yung magkaroon ka doon ng samples na pareho lang, tapos merong may slight difference para makita mo kung, halimbawa, 3 samples mo doon, ano yung rating nila doon sa 3 samples na yun? Yan bang magkaparehong samples, magkaparehas din or similar yung rating nila? Yung sample ba na naiiba, mas nalalayo yung numerical ratings nila? Ganon. So one of the most common screening test methods done is for basic taste, similar to dun sa exercise 1 ninyo. Okay. So identification of basic taste lang ito. And the 100% score is required. Now, if you can't even tell sweet from sour at slightly lower concentrations, then you have a problem. So we also have odor recognition tests. Siyempre, there's a limit to how many odorants you can give per session kasi yung ilong nila baka masakit na, no? And typically, you start with the more familiar odors. And then you could also include ratings if odors are pleasant or unacceptable. So, usually, ito yung ginagamit nyo na score sheet na nag-exercise 1 kayo, ma-identify, associate, characterize, or attempt to describe. Of course, you can also opt to use, depending on your sample, odors that are closer to the ones that will be used in testing. So, meron kang parang general or broad, and then merong mas specific. Okay, nasa sa iyo na yun, no? But if you're gonna use general, you want to start with the more common ones. Like, wag mo naman bigyan niya ng yung mga licorice or I don't know, maybe yung mga hindi naman spices na hindi normally na-encounter sa bansa natin, ganun. So intensity ranking is also one of the screening methods. It's based on the idea of thresholds that there's a minimum level we can detect and differentiate when it comes to the intensity of attributes like, let's say, sweetness or maybe texture attributes like hardness and so on. So meron din kayo nitong idea kasi meron kayong activity supposed to be nito sa lab, although you won't be able to do it live nga lang kasi hindi tayo face-to-face. So panelists are instructed to rank the samples in order of increasing concentration. And to test the performance of the panelists, una, tingnan mo yung deviation niya mula sa group mean, okay? Although it doesn't mean na mas malapit siya sa group mean ay automatically reliable na siya. Kasi pwede rin ibig sabihin lang nito ay hindi talaga nila ma-differentiate yung samples. So what you're expecting is that although there is this one group mean, yung individual means ng kada tao ay maaaring magkakaiba. So we can consider a judge to be reliable if there is low deviation from the mean, but the mean scores of the panelists are different. So you can click this link to watch the footage of descriptive sensory evaluation in practice. Take note that there are different stages to it. No? So makikita nyo, may mga times na nasa isang parang round table sila, may mga times na they're on separate tables, and may mga times na they're working on the sensory evaluation booth. So that's because there are different phases to descriptive sensory analysis depending on what the test type is, no? Kasi maraming klase ng descriptive sensory analysis. And usually, yung mga times na magkakasama sila sa isang room at nag-uusap-usap, yan yung time na may dinidiscuss ka pa sa mga earlier stages. Doon mismo sa part na nag-a-analyze kayo ng samples, doon naman kayo usually naghiwa-hiwalay na para hindi kayo maka-influence sa isa't isa.